Hello there, and welcome to 2023. The year that we tell ourselves will be way better than 2022, and while we may be right in some ways, we are probably wrong in a lot of others. So last year around this time, I made a video just like this one, where I made a tier list of all the movies I watched in 2021. Specifically the movies that came out in 2021 that I watched. Just because despite what social media may leave you to believe, there are in fact more movies than the ones that just came out this year. However, for the sake of timeliness and for the sake of not having an incredibly long list, I do stick to just having the movies that came out during the year. And this year, the tier list will be much longer because I watched a lot more movies. And considering that my New Year's resolution, besides spending less time on TikTok because that app is slowly taking away my soul, is to watch more movies, next year will probably be even longer. Now, before we get into it, I do want to lay down some, rules or whatever. I'm going to be talking about these movies in the order that they were released, not in the order that I watched them. If you want to see my movies in the order that I watched the movies, then you can follow me on Letterboxd. I'm TS Dennis. But for now, I'm only talking about them in the release order so that everyone is kind of into speed. I will be avoiding spoilers in this section, but if you want to avoid any kind of spoilers at all, I will include timestamps for every single movie that I talk about here. You do with that what you will. And I'm sorry for all of the sound upstairs, if you can hear that. And my last little disclaimer type thing is that this is all opinion. This is all completely subjective. I'm not saying that my taste is better than yours. Disagree with me all you want in the comments. It fuels engagement and such. But just know that I'm not saying that I'm the end all be all of movie authority. But with all that aside, let's just get right into the tier list. So starting off, we have Netflix's The House. In case you do not know, this was a short little horror special on Netflix that included 3 short stories that take place within the same house. It's stop motion, it has different directors and everything. It's very cool and kind of artsy and all that. So I kind of have iffy feelings about this one because some of the stories are better than others. The first story is kind of boring a little bit, but the second story I really loved, and it's just really creepy and freaky and stuff. And then the third one wasn't really so much a horror story, it was just a story. So I don't know. It felt kind of like a somewhat mixed kind of thing. It felt very confused as to what it was going to do, but the parts of it that were really good, and then the parts that weren't kind of just dragged it down a little bit overall. So if I was to look at it individually as a series of short stories, the first story would probably be a C tier, the second story would be an A or an S, and the third story would be a solid B. So I think I'm going to average that out, going to be a B tier. Next off, we have the new Scream 5, or just Scream 2022, however you want to call it. Okay, so full transparency, I watched all of the Scream movies except for the first one, which I had seen before. For the first time this year, I wanted to watch all of them for Halloween, and so that may have affected my opinions of it, but I really liked this one. It's the second or third best, I think, out of the whole franchise, because the first one's obviously the best. I think that it's tied between 4 and 5 for my personal second favorite, and I know that's not a super popular opinion because I know a lot of people really don't like this one, but I enjoyed it. It was a pretty solid satire of modern fans in general. It has all the original cast. I think the original cast all did great, and it also has Jenna Ortega in it, and I'm always a big fan of Jenna Ortega in whatever role she's in. A little bit of bias there, but yeah, I really enjoyed Scream. I'd probably have to say Scream 5 or Scream 2022 is probably gonna be an A tier. Alright, Uncharted. I did not grow up with a PlayStation, so I did not play a lot of the PlayStation games, so I did not play Uncharted, but I've been meaning to for a long time, and I've heard that this movie isn't a very good adaptation of the games, so I figured if I started with the movie, then I could have the games be way better instead of going in the opposite direction of having the games be great and then the movie be way worse. I grant you it's weird, bizarro logic, but it's what I decided to go with. I don't know. It's fine. It's the Lara Croft, Indiana Jones, National Treasure type movie, adventure movie, but they didn't really do anything new with it, and there wasn't really anything particularly compelling about this adaptation. Tom Holland is fine, and Mark Wahlberg, if that is Mark Wahlberg, I always get him confused with someone else. They were just okay. There really wasn't a lot to grab onto with this movie, so I wouldn't say it's bad necessarily, although I do say that with the context of it not knowing what it's like as an adaptation. But as a movie, it's just okay. So for Uncharted, I think I'm going to say it's a C tier. It's just average. It's just okay. It could be way better, but it also could be way worse. So next we have The Adam Project. This one actually surprised me a little bit because I was expecting it to be just kind of bad. All I knew about it was that it was like a Ryan Reynolds movie and that like it was about time travel. But I thought it was pretty solid. Like as far as time travel stories go, it's kind of middle of the road. But like the performances really sold it for me. Like Ryan Reynolds is very charismatic and he kind of plays the same character in every movie, and that can be kind of off-putting. But for this one, I think it really worked. I think the reason that it really worked was because the kid that they got to play like the younger version of Ryan Reynolds' character was just a perfect mirror to him. And that kind of novelty of that really sold it, I think. The emotional story it was going for worked pretty well for what it was. Like it wasn't amazing. Like it didn't touch me super hard. That sounds weird, but it is what it is. And I think that for the weaknesses of like some of the plot holes and like weaker elements of the story, I think that it really does make up for it with those performance elements and those emotional elements. So I wouldn't say it's like a great movie, but I do think it was pretty solid. So I'll put it also in B tier. Now we have our first like big budget animated movie. We have Turning Red from Pixar, which was I think the only Pixar movie I watched this year. I know Lightyear also came out, but I didn't see that. But yeah, Turning Red was great. I know that I got a lot of weird backlash when it came out. I made a video about that if you haven't seen it already. But the movie itself is pretty solid. Like, it's very much a time capsule of like the early 2000s, which I wasn't really alive for. From what I have seen of that era, it does seem like it was a love letter to that time, and I saw a lot of people online who were the age that the girls are in this movie really like appreciating it and really like just enjoying it for what it was. So it seems like it did pretty well in that, and the whole story about like teen anxiety with growing up and with your parents and conflict with your parents was really good, and I thought it was pretty relatable even for like a cis white guy who doesn't experience a lot of the specific things they were talking about. And I imagine that for its specific target audience, then it worked really well. So I have to give it props for that. Even though it wasn't necessarily meant for me, I still really enjoyed it, and I was still able to find a lot of enjoyment out of it, and I really appreciate when a movie is like that. So Turning Red, I think, will also be an A tier. Pretty solid movie. All right, this one's one that probably a lot of you are waiting for, The Batman. I am not a huge Batman aficionado or anything. Like, I've seen a lot of the movies, but I haven't read a whole lot of the comics, and most of my experience comes from like the Lego games and like through some of the cartoons and stuff. Like I watched some of Batman the Animated Series when I was younger, but this really did feel like that same Batman in those adaptations. Like a lot of the movie versions of Batman have just kind of been like dark brooding guy who like kills people and stuff, and he's like super cool and he's like a military man kind of a thing. Kind of felt like that. It was kind of the Punisher, but he's rich and he wears a funny hat. But this really like kind of got to the core of what I always liked about the character, which was class elements and more of the like social elements that crime is surrounded by. It just had a lot of like really good social commentary for a superhero movie, which I know they don't always hit the mark on. It's also just a beautiful movie. It's so well shot. It's so great. Like Robert Pattinson does a great job as Batman. All the performances are great. I don't know. I really enjoyed it. I think it might be one of the best, if not the best, like comic book movies I've ever seen. So I think that The Batman is probably going to be, for the first time this year, it's going to be an S tier. Next we have X from A24 and Ty West. I really tried to get into horror this year, and X was a great like entry into that, and it kind of inspired me to watch a whole bunch of other slasher movies and stuff, and it eventually led to me writing a paper actually for my college about how horror from the 1980s and 90s, specifically slashers, how movies moralized acts of sexual freedom or whatever as being bad because of more conservative sentiments at the time. And I really liked how X kind of flipped that on its head and decided to be like, it's like a slasher horror movie about a adult film set, which you think would be really exploitative, but it isn't. It kind of takes that really exploitative concept, does something really, really interesting with it. So if that sounds good at all to you, I really do recommend it. It's a great movie and a great horror movie all around. Wouldn't say it's quite S tier, but it's definitely like a pretty solid A tier. So, all right, next we have one of the big ones, Everything Everywhere All at Once. If you haven't seen it, then you've probably heard about it already. Like people have been talking about how this is like the best movie of the year or like one of their favorite movies ever. And I will say it, I'm in that camp too. I think that this is like easily the best movie that came out this year, and it might be one of the best movies I think I've ever seen. I don't ever want to say that there's like a perfect movie, because I know nothing is perfect, but like Everything Everywhere All at Once I think comes as close to being a perfect movie as I think you can. Great emotional comedy, great social commentary, great like performances. Like if Michelle Yeoh does not at least get nominated for Best Actress, there's going to be some words. Personally, Out of the movies I've seen, this is my pick for Best Picture. With Hollywood politics, I don't know if that'll actually happen, but easy S tier. Easy S tier. All right, Morbius. Scratch everything I just said about Everything Ever All at Once. Morbius is easily the best movie that came out this year. God. Since that meme has died like several months ago, even though I milked it kind of hard, yeah, this movie was not very good. It was really boring and pretty nonsensical. It was pretty clear it went through like some troubles like in production, but also just the fact that it didn't seem to be made for any kind of actual artistic reason. It was very much just like a product of a movie. The jokes around it were way more entertaining than anything that was actually in the movie. I don't know if I'd call it like the worst of the worst, but like it was pretty bad. It might be the worst movie I saw all year, so yeah, I think I'm probably gonna have to put it in F tier. Sonic the Hedgehog 2. Sonic the Hedgehog was really interesting to me because I'm not a huge Sonic fan. You'd have to ask my friend Gamma about that, Mechanist Gamma. He's a huge Sonic person, but I really was not expecting a whole lot from the first movie because video game movies are generally pretty bad. But the first movie was actually like kind of decent. Like it wasn't amazing or anything. And I think it's the same for this movie. It's not amazing or anything, but it's a pretty solid movie, especially for like what you'd expect from like a video game movie. I do think the best part of this movie for me was Jim Carrey, because, you know, Jim Carrey is Jim Carrey, and his performance as Robotnik was electric. It does seem to be leaning more into like the video gamey, wacky elements of the world than the first one did, which I think is good. I think that movies take themselves pretty seriously nowadays, and so like allowing adaptations of video games should be allowed to be video gamey. So I'm glad they kind of went that route. So it's probably also going to be in B tier. Right, next we have The Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent, the Nick Cage movie, like the Nicolas movie about how great Nicolas Cage is. I was going into this movie expecting it to be like wild, expecting it to be like this really intense thing, and I don't think that's quite what it was. I think that outside of some of the jokes, it is kind of a little middle of the road for action comedies or whatever. They kind of just play up a lot of Nicolas Cage references, and a lot of those are just the joke. But that isn't to say it's bad at all. I do think it is funny. I think it's a funny movie. Like a lot of that is through Pedro Pascal and Nicolas Cage's like repertoire. They have a great dynamic, and I think that the bits where Nicolas Cage is talking to himself are great. Overall, I think it was a little bit of a letdown, but not enough for me to actually be disappointed with it. It was just like it delivered on what it initially set out to be, which was to be a movie about Nicolas Cage. I don't think it did quite as much as it could have with that premise, but it still fulfilled it to a certain extent. So I think it's also going to be in B tier. All right, next we have The Bad Guys, which I will be honest, I was not expecting a whole lot from. Most of what is good about this movie is the animation. The animation is incredible. I love the animation. It's so beautiful. It's got like this great like punchiness to it that I don't really see a whole lot. The actual story itself is kind of wacky, but like not super and like actually very fun kind of wacky, but more just like a kind of crazy things are happening kind of a way. I did think that the performances from a lot of the things, like I particularly liked the performance of the actor who played the snake. I can't remember who it was, but then there's also on the opposite end, there's like Awkwafina playing the tarantula, who was pretty much a non-entity in this movie. I don't hate to say like keep saying just solid, but it's like a better way of saying mid because mid is just such a word that has been like colonized by people who actually mean bad, but they just say mid because it sounds less harsh. But it's, you know, it's very middle of the road, so probably going to be also in B tier. B tier is getting pretty crowded now. Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness. Okay, so this is going to be interesting because I have been accused before of being a Marvel shill, and I just have to say to that you are kind of right. I don't know, I thought Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness was good. It was like a pretty good movie. Like if you didn't go into it with the expectation of another Endgame or another like Infinity War level crossover event, which apparently some people seem to, it was like a very well directed movie too. Like Sam Raimi's directorial style really did shine through in this, as like, you know, in comparison to like other Marvel projects in terms of directorial style. Like the only other director who has had this much of an imprint on their Marvel project have been James Gunn with the Guardians movies. Thought that it was like sufficiently like corny. It was kind of going for like a corny B-movie style feeling, but with like a Marvel movie budget. And I think it really did succeed in that level. Like it probably had some of the most like intense stuff that is in the MCU. Like it's some of the stuff I'm surprised they were able to get away with in terms of a PG-13 rating. I think that one's going to be an A tier, which, you know, I will get crucified for putting Doctor Strange and Multiverse of Madness in the same tier as X, but it's how I feel. So, Chip 'n Dale Rescue Rangers. Okay, so here's the proof that I'm not a Disney shill. I saw a lot of people who really liked this movie, and I don't know. It's kind of this trend now where movies who have a lot of access to different IP kind of just put them all together in one big movie, like how Warner Brothers has two with Ready Player One and with Space Jam 2. And so Disney tried to do it with Chip 'n Dale Rescue Rangers. I did think it was pretty creative in certain ways, and I did like the joke about Sonic. I think Andy Samberg did great in this role, but like John Mulaney was pretty distracting. I don't know. It was very much like less a movie about Chip and Dale than it was a movie about, hey, look at all these properties we have and stuff, and look at this kind of product that we have where we can put all these things together. Look, don't you like how much this stuff Disney has? Don't you remember that Disney thing that happened? Well, it's in this movie. I'll give it some credit for like its creativity, but overall it just kind of felt tech demo-y, if that makes sense. Probably gonna be C tier. Actually, I might even move it to D tier. All right, Elvis. Okay. Remember what I said about how I liked it when directors have their distinct directorial style? That has its limits. I think that Baz Luhrmann is very much the director's style director. Like, if his movies have anything, they have style. And sometimes that works. Like, I think it works for Romeo plus Juliet and for parts of Moulin Rouge, but it really does not work for this movie. It kind of feels just like there was one review I saw that compared it to like an hour long, which isn't to say it's bad necessarily. Like, it's competently made. It's just like too intense. Not even talking about the story, which I have talked about my feelings on biopics before. I also just like don't like Elvis as a person. I think that the movie did a pretty good job of romanticizing Elvis, not talking about the fact that he met his wife when he was 24 and she was 14, fun little stuff like that. I don't know. It was just kind of like a bit of a mess. It's a weird movie and not really in a good way, so I think I'm also going to put it in D tier. So, all right, The Black Phone. Oh, this one's gonna get me in trouble. So I saw a lot of people saying that this movie was like one of the best horror movies they've ever seen, that it was really scary. I don't see it. This isn't like me trying to be like a contrarian. I promise I'm not trying to be a contrarian here. I just genuinely was not scared at all by this movie, and I wasn't really compelled otherwise by it. Like, some of the kid performances are pretty good, emphasis on some of them, but like, other than Ethan Hawke being like this weirdo fun guy who was like really fun to see on screen, this movie just really did not have a lot going for it. I think the way that I can best put it is that it manages to take a serial killer who kidnaps children for his own like weird games and made that concept not scary. I don't know if I just watched it the wrong way or something, but yeah, this movie just really was not very good. It was pretty fun. I'll give it that. It was a fun movie, but it just wasn't a great movie. I don't want to be mean to it. I could be mean to it and put it in F tier, but I think I'm going to also put it in D tier with these three. So now that I've angered everyone in the horror community, let's move on. Marcel the Shell with Shoes On. This was pretty good. I think that this might have a shot at winning Best Animated Feature, because it does qualify for Best Animated Feature from what I can tell. And if that's the case, I do think that it probably is like one of the two movies on this list that I think should win it. It has so much sincerity to it, if that makes sense. Like, I know that a lot of film critics really don't like feel-good movies just because it's not deep or whatever, but I do think that this had some pretty deep messages about belonging and stuff, and it was conveyed really well, and this yearning for having a larger place in life, and it was also just really, really endearing. It's a really endearing movie. It's really cute. Marcel is a wonderful little character. I will say this is probably the best movie I've ever seen that's based off of a YouTube video. If you haven't seen it, I really do recommend it. It's such a fun little thing. All right, I think I'm gonna put it in A tier with it's an understanding of it's a high A tier. If there was a tier between S and A, it'd probably go there. All right, Thor: Love and Thunder. Now this is where I lose all of my credibility. This movie is not that bad. It's not good. I mean, it's not terrible or awful or anything. That's where my sticking point is. It is a movie that I think is definitely on the lower end of Marvel movies, but most Marvel movies aren't amazing, guys. It has a lot of really good elements, a lot of really solid elements, but those elements don't really mix as well. Like, I think that Gore is wonderful as a villain in this movie, but I do think he doesn't really fit the tone of the movie as well, even though he does fit some of the themes that they're going for. I do think that the movie does have kind of the Whedon effect of having too much, like, jokes at certain points and, like, too much focusing on, like, specific humor in certain, like, places where it's not very, appropriate. But I also think that performances and, like, the rom-com element of it is kind of overlooked, and I think that's pretty well done. And I think that, like, the ending is sufficiently emotional. I think the thing is just, like, this movie is not as bad as people say it is, and Ragnarok is not as good as people say it is. I think that they're a lot closer to each other than people like to pretend they are. This movie is just, like, a few steps down from what Ragnarok is. Which isn't to say I don't like Ragnarok. And it's, again, not to say I don't like this movie. I think it's a very messy movie, but, like, the parts of it that are good, that I really like. So I think it's going to be a high C tier movie. The parts of it that are bad are pretty bad, but the parts of it that are good are really good. So it kind of evens out to just like a all right for me. All right, next up we have Prey. I'm just realizing just how like hot takes I'm actually giving here. But I'm not a huge fan of the first Predator movie. I never watched any of the other Predator movies besides this, but I don't know. I guess I just found it to be too much of like a macho man fighting in the forest kind of 80s movie. I don't think it's a bad movie by any means or anything, so don't come at me there. I don't know, it just wasn't really for me. So I was kind of hesitant about this movie, but to my surprise, I really enjoyed this one. My brother forced me to watch it because he's really into Predator, but this one was really solid. I think that it might be better than the original, or at the very least, I like it more than the original. It's a pretty great horror movie, and it's great for all of like the native representation that it does and all of the effort they put into it. I think that as like a cultural piece, it's great just for that alone. It's also just really well shot and really well edited, and it's really well acted and everything, and it's well written. It's just a really solid movie. I keep saying solid. I gotta stop saying solid. But yeah, I really liked Prey, so I think it's also another high A tier. And now I'm looking at it, I might move Doctor Strange to B tier. So just all right, next up, Jordan Peele's Nope. If you've seen the movie before, I want to preface this by saying that I already had a fear of chimpanzees before I watched this movie. This movie did not make that better. But yeah, I loved Nope. If you've seen Jordan Peele's other movies, then you know that he's like really good at like these subversive horror, and I could just like talk about the themes of Nope for so long. I kind of did a little bit in that video about Logan Paul's review of Nope. It's a really funny movie, as you might see by the title, but it is genuinely pretty scary as well. There's like two scenes in particular that stick out in my mind. It's just like I really was not able to sleep very well after watching them, and those were the one with the chimpanzee and one that's, inside the ship. Because yeah, if you don't know, this movie is about aliens, so I don't think that's much of a spoiler. That's kind of the conceit of it, but this movie's about aliens. But yeah, if you haven't seen Nope, I really recommend it. It's just a great horror movie, and it's also a pretty great comedy and a good thriller and like a pretty solid family drama, but it's also just like got so many interesting themes about like spectacle and how we mythologize and we commodify tragedy and things and terrible things happening. It's such an interesting movie. It's such a fun time. I really love it. Heavily recommend Nope, and it was one of my favorite movies that came out this year, so definitely going to be an S tier for me. Another really solid choice, Bullet Train. I was surprised to see that a lot of critics did not like this movie. The scores were pretty low for this movie, and I was surprised because when I watched it, I really enjoyed it. It's not a very deep movie or anything, but it is like this fun little, like, I don't know, it's just a fun action set piece type movie. It's really funny. It's really like energetic. It's got a lot of great performances in it. I think that if you really like movies like Knives Out and like Deadpool, like it's kind of like a combination between those two for me. That's kind of the vibes I got from it. I think just for pure enjoyment alone, I will put it in S tier. I'm not saying it's like necessarily an S tier quality movie, but I really loved it. It was one of my favorite movies that came out this year, so that's where it goes. Next up, we have Bodies, 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 another A24 horror movie. You know how like there's this trend in Hollywood where they make movies that make fun of Gen Z or satirize Gen Z or whatever, and it's always like way off and like just not accurate at all, and it's kind of cringy because of that. This is not one of those. It's one of the first, I think it's the first movie that I've ever seen that actually accurately satirizes Gen Z and like the Generation Z culture. And it's really funny. It's like a really funny movie because of that satirization of like a very specific subset of Gen Z, of like rich, privileged teenagers who are big on social media kind of a thing. From what I understand, a lot of the Gen Z actors were allowed to improvise and add depth to that, and also it just seems like the writer really had an understanding of that, and I think it really paid off. If you have not seen this movie, I really recommend it, especially if like you are Gen Z and you like seeing well done satire. And the ending is absolutely like amazing. I love the ending so much, but I can't say it obviously because, you know, spoilers. It's one of those movies that has like an amazing plot twist that just completely changes everything and makes it so much better. So high A tier, like high A tier. Like it's in the same vein as Marcel in terms of like if there was a term one between S and A, it would be there. Highly recommend Bodies, Bodies, Bodies. The Woman King. The Woman King is interesting to me because it is a movie where they do take some historical liberties from my understanding from the source material, from like the historical source material, but it's not any more than movies like 300 or Gladiator do. So people got upset about this movie because it, you know, is a movie about a collection of black women who are warriors. So of course people are going to get upset about it. But like that's the part that's accurate, you know? The part of it that's accurate is the part that people are mad about. It's kind of a funny thing to get upset about because like the inaccurate parts are just like what roles that they played in the slave trade and stuff. I'm not a huge fan of like war dramas or of like action war kind of things like in that sense, but as far as they go, this is pretty good for me. I think that Viola Davis in it is absolutely the highlight because of course she is, because she is the Woman King. She's phenomenal in this movie, as she is in every movie. So she's the best part, I think, but overall it is a pretty solid movie. So I'll give it an A tier. Not a high A tier, but just an A tier. All right, next up we have Do Revenge, which was a Netflix exclusive. This is another one of those movies that I had pretty low expectations for, but I was surprised by how much I enjoyed it. You know those movies like Legally Blonde and like He's All That is another one I was thinking of. Movies that are from like the 90s or early 2000s that are just about like teens. He's All That or She's All That, I can't remember. Whatever the one that came out in the 90s is. It's just like a combination of all those, but like in a modern setting. It has that same kind of feeling and it, you know, works really well, I think. The chemistry is great. It's like a pretty great drama slash dramedy comedy thing. It does feel a little bit on the nose in some places, and it does feel like some parts are a bit contrived. It's really enjoyable, but I do think that it's kind of not super well written. Like it is well written, but not like, it's the dialogue and like the comedy that's well written, not necessarily the plot, if that makes sense. So I think that this is probably going to be about a B tier, but with the understanding that I really enjoyed it. So, all right, up next is the prequel to X, which is called Pearl. I really loved Pearl. It's very hit or miss. I think it's one of those movies that kind of takes a while to get started a little bit. It's good, but like the pacing is kind of iffy a little bit. And I think that the issue with it is that you don't always know exactly what's happening until like it happens. But I think that upon a rewatch, I really enjoyed it a lot more just because some of the parts hit better. And Pearl herself is great. Mia Goth, is it Mia Goth? It's either Mia or Maya. I think it's Mia. Mia Goth is really phenomenal in Pearl and X, but she's especially phenomenal in Pearl. Like there's this one monologue that she gives that's almost 6 or 7 minutes long. It's just one uncut take of her just giving this monologue, and she is incredible in it. I think that it's about on equal footing for X, but it's a bit uneven, if that makes sense. Like X is more solidly good, and Pearl has kind of like, it has some kind of low points, but it has higher highs, and so it still evens out to about the same, but it like is more of a roller coaster, if that makes sense. So I think it's also going to be in A tier, even though there are parts of it that are kind of more uneven. Hocus Pocus 2. Now, I've seen very mixed things about this sequel, and honestly, I do have kind of mixed feelings about it myself. First of all, obviously, it's a legacy sequel to a Disney movie made by Disney for Disney Plus, and thus it has a lot of like its edges wired off from its part in the 90s. And I think that a lot of like the actual quality is worse, although to be fair, the original Hocus Pocus movie is really not that good. Like, if you were a fan of Hocus Pocus, like, don't lie. It's not very good. But I'm a fan of Hocus Pocus 2, Hocus Pocus the first one as well. And so, even though it's pretty bad, I know that I like it because of its, like, more campy elements, and mainly, its performance of the sisters, like the 3 actresses who played the sisters, and honestly, they just came back in full force. I think that was really the thing that really needed to work for this movie to be enjoyable. I really liked this movie. I really did. I think that it was loads of fun, but I think it's also important to acknowledge that it was not because it was good. If we're going by like just my enjoyment of it, it's an easy S tier. But in terms of actual quality, it's probably more like a D or a C. I don't want to put it in either of those though, because those don't feel right. So I think I am going to like kind of give it a compromise and go with a B tier as well. It's really enjoyable, but it's really not that good. So, all right, next we have Entergalactic. This was a really pleasant surprise because I just found it like while I was scrolling on Netflix one day, and I didn't realize it even came out this year. If you haven't seen it, it's just like this rom-com types movie it's kind of like When Harry Met Sally mixed with Spider-Verse. It's great. It's just like this really beautiful animated movie that's about these 2 people who meet and fall in love. I would just really recommend it. Like, it has some kind of adult humor in it, so if like you're sensitive to that. What is going on up there? It kind of has some adult humor into it, so like if you're kind of sensitive to that, then I might, advise you against it. I don't know, it's just a really pretty story. It's really simple and like enjoyable. It's like a movie that's like the story itself is pretty simple, but like the journey and presentation itself has got so much artistry in it, and it's so beautiful. I will say it's also a high A tier. Honestly, I probably should have just made a tier between A and B. Marvel Studio presents Werewolf by Night. This was easily my favorite Marvel thing that came out this year. Like I said, I really got into horror this year, but part of that is I've always had this appreciation for like universal horror, like universal monster horror from like the 1930s or whatever. And so this was just like right up my alley. And they really allowed this movie to play into that more, and they like Michael Giacchino, who is a great composer, was doing a great job with directing this, and he just did so well with it. I don't know. It's another case of it's really simple, but it's really effective because it's like not in that Marvel feeling genre of like superhero quippy kind of story. It's just like, it's a monster movie. It's an old classic monster movie that just happens to be in the MCU. So it's an A tier. It's not like a high A tier or anything. It's just A tier, but it is A tier. A tier, A tier, A tier. All right, we're kind of getting towards the end. We're getting towards November and everything, or like the end of October. And we get our next like stop motion animated movie, which there were a lot of this year, which I was really nice to see. Wendell and Wild. This was a movie made by Jordan Peele and by Henry Selick, who, if you don't know, are the director behind Nope and Get Out and Us. That's Jordan Peele. And Nightmare Before Christmas is Henry Selick. Nightmare Before Christmas and Coraline, not Tim Burton. Actually, like Tim Burton did not direct either of those movies. They worked together to make this movie, and I think that it turned out really well. I do think that it was kind of a movie that wanted to do everything. It was kind of doing a whole lot, and I do think that kind of took away from some of its stronger elements. Like, I think that if it was a bit more focused, it would have been a lot better, but it was still really good. The animation was incredible, obviously, and the performances from Key and Peele, specifically as Wendell and Wild, were great. I'm gonna say it again, it's a really solid movie, so I hope this video is entertaining. So it's also going to be an A tier. Next, we have Weird, the Al Yankovic Story, which was the satirical biopic about Weird Al Yankovic, the parody song musician who, if you somehow don't know about. This movie was hilarious. This whole thing is just like, it's riffing off of like all those biopics, musician biopics, like Elvis and like Bohemian Rhapsody and stuff like that. And it just took that and went absolutely like wild with it. Daniel Radcliffe plays Weird Al, and it's not at all accurate to his real life. And that's like the whole joke, is that it's so like exaggerative about like things that clearly didn't happen, and it's great. I love it so much. This movie was such a blast. I honestly would probably have to say it's in S tier for me personally. It's one of those comedy movies that like just goes above and beyond. It's just absolutely incredible to watch. So, all right, next we have My Father's Dragon from Cartoon Saloon, who, if you don't know, are the studio behind movies like Wolf Walkers and Secret of the Kells and stuff like that. I was really excited for this movie because I read the My Father's Dragon books a lot when I was a kid, and they were very nostalgic for me. And I really love the other movies that this studio does, but I do think that honestly this movie kind of fell short a little bit. It took a lot of liberties with the story, which is not my problem with it. I don't know. It's a good movie, but like compared to the other movies that Cartoon Saloon has made, it's not like as beautiful and so emotionally told as those movies, so it kind of fell a little bit short, which is kind of disappointing, but it's like a pretty good B tier. Final 5, we've got Black Panther Wakanda Forever. While Werewolf by Night was my favorite project this year from Marvel, I do think Wakanda Forever is the best one because it has so much. It's kind of hard to say stuff that a bunch of people already haven't said. Like it's such a great tribute to Chadwick Boseman and his unfortunate passing. Its performances are so well done from all the actors who are like mourning that actor, and it really just feels like a tribute rather than like exploitation, which some people have accused it of being. I also think that the villain is one of the best villains in any like superhero movie. It really did feel like it was a serious drama rather than like the kind of quippy Whedon-y effect of other. I think it's also going to be in A tier. Right. Up next we have Disenchanted, which was the sequel to Enchanted, which is one of my favorite like Disney movies ever, and I was really looking forward to Disenchanted, even though it's like another legacy sequel that's a long time afterwards, and it kind of suffers from a lot of the same problems that Hocus Pocus 2 suffers from, that being kind of boring in terms of actual story written. But the problem with that this movie has that Hocus Pocus 2 doesn't is that unfortunately the charisma of the leads are not able to save it in this case, because like the whole appeal of Hocus Pocus I think was just the fact that it was pretty bad, but that it was so like bonkers and the performances were so off the wild that it was entertaining. But like the appeal for Enchanted is that it was just actually like a good movie, and that this movie just doesn't really have that as much. I don't know if like that's an unpopular opinion, because some people seem to think that Hocus Pocus 2 is way worse than Disenchanted, which I just don't see. Yeah, I was unfortunately very disappointed with Disenchanted, and I think it's probably going to be a D tier. D for Disenchanted. Perfect. Glass Onion, a Knives Out story. Now, I was very fortunate to be able to see this movie when it was in theaters in November before it went to Netflix on December. And yeah, if you know me, you know that I love the first Knives Out. Before Everything Ever All at Once came out, Knives Out was my favorite movie. And so I had very high expectations for this one, and I am very glad to say that I think it exceeded those expectations. Like, this movie is just as good, if not better, than the original Knives Out. And I know that's like some people are saying it's worse and stuff. Glass Onion is great. It's very different from the original Knives Out. Like it's not just Knives Out again, which is, you know, maybe kind of confusing because it's a Knives Out mystery. But really the only connection that they have is that they're both written and directed by Rian Johnson, and that they both have the same detective, which is Benoit Blanc, played by Daniel Craig, who is way better in this movie, I think, than he was in Knives Out. Like, not only just his like accent has gotten way better, and I think he just has way more of a presence in this one. Glass Onion is great. If you have Netflix and you haven't watched Glass Onion yet, what are you doing? Like I said, you don't have to watch the first Knives Out to get it, so easy S tier for me. I've watched it 3 times already, so. All right, next we have the Guardians of the Galaxy Holiday Special. I don't know, it's the Guardians of the Galaxy Holiday Special. It's about what you'd expect. Obviously, I do think that the movies themselves are better. I think that Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 is one of the best like comic book movies I've ever seen. You know, some of that does translate to this, but I do think that this is a lot less high stakes. It's just kind of a fun little Guardians romp that's holiday themed. I think it's well written for what it is. It's well directed. It's very competent holiday special, and that's all it's trying to be, so it works. So I think I'm probably gonna have to put it in A tier. I guess I am a bit of a Marvel shill, huh, aren't I? And last but certainly not least, we have Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio. Oh, this movie is beautiful. Remember how I said how if it wasn't for another entry on this list, I would want Marcel the Shell to win? This is the other entry. This is like such a well done and like hauntingly beautiful movie. It's so beautifully animated. It's so well acted. It's just so good. I like cried several times during this movie. One of those times was in the first 10 minutes. So it like joins up in that whole genre of movies that make you cry in like the first 10 minutes. This was just such a beautiful movie. And I know there are 2 other Pinocchio movies that came out this year, and this one is the best. Like, without even having seen the other 2, I just know this one is the best. So this one's also going to be going in S tier, because it's just a beautiful movie. And that's about that. That's my tier list for 2022 movies that I saw. Next year, I'll probably watch even more movies, and so the list will be even longer, and the video will be even longer, and I know you guys will love that. So feel free to screenshot this list and then, like, take your hot takes from it or whatever. But again, know that this is just my opinion about things, and I am almost certain that like you disagree with at least one of these choices. So, you know, just be civil in the comments and stuff. I am really looking forward to 2023 and just like seeing how that goes. And I think this is a great tradition to start the year off with. And if you enjoyed this video, if you're new somehow, feel free to like this video and subscribe and stuff and all that stuff and things and all that jazz. Let me know like what your personal rankings of these movies would be. Like just tell me, like I said, be civil, but like do feel free to tell me like what you think. I have a whole bunch of socials and stuff in the description, like my previously mentioned Letterboxd, but also other platforms and stuff. I sincerely hope that you're having a good day, and that if not, that your day just continues to get better. And I guess I'll see you in the next video. Bye!